My name is Finola Finlay. I'm a committee member for the History Festival. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Edward Burke. He's a lecturer at UCD in the history of war since 1945. I mean, he hasn't been there since 1945. You get it. He came there after a short and distinguished career in English universities and English institutions. He received his PhD in international relations in 2016 from the University of St. Andrews. And his latest book, is called An Army of Tribes, and it's about intergenerational violence in the border region. But the best part is, he's a Ross Carbery man. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Edward Burke.
Thank you very much, and it's an absolute pleasure to be home and to be among you today. This is a wonderful festival, and so impressed with the way that Simon, Victoria, and all the committee have grown this over the last few years, and asked some really difficult and fascinating questions that are really germane to what we do as historians, and the setting is just magnificent. So, thank you again. I suppose really the motivations. The first thing I should say is, well, I'll refer you to the slide here. Actually, the first thing I should say is that I'm a historian of the in-betweens, right? So I like things that are perhaps on the fringes or slightly, forgotten about. And I sort of like digging in and seeing if I can reveal histories that have been hidden for various reasons, or maybe even just, in plain sight, but not particularly talked about. And so a lot of what I'm going to focus on today is what Ulster Unionists in 1920 briefly referred to as the lost counties, right? So, and of course, we can call them the three counties, the three Ulster counties that are within the Irish state today and have been obviously since the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And this picture here is of a loyalist who was celebrating the successful defence of his house against the IRA. In May 1922, the IRA attacked his house. He sort of fired a number of revolver shots, ran out of ammunition, grabbed a rifle, fired more shots, wounded 6 IRA volunteers, and him and his son survived. But they had to leave the country afterwards for a period, and eventually did come back. But I have received this picture from his descendants on the basis that I cannot tell you who he is. I can't tell you which of the counties this is, because they are very sensitive that, in terms of contemporary Ireland, that they don't want to, as they put it, sort of reawaken any antipathy in terms of people resenting their family even in 2023. So we're dealing with, we're in complex territory here. So you can kind of find these things, but it takes a long, long time, and it takes, you have to build up trust in the border regions. So initially, Finola very kindly talked about my previous book, and I was interested in when I did An Army of Tribes, and one of the chapters there is about a British Army unit, the 1st Battalion Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, who were in Fermanagh in 1972. A Ulster Defence Regiment, a part-time private soldier, farmer called Robin Bell, whose family are actually from Ross Carbery, not only from Ross Carbery originally, but from the same townland as myself. But they moved north of the border. Of course, in West Cork, there was no loyalist militant organisations in the 20th century. There was no paramilitary defence groups. But of course, when, as a few West Cork Protestants did when they moved north, there was a certain social pressure clearly to get on board with things like either the Ulster Volunteer Force in the early 20th century or the Ulster Special Constabulary and later the Ulster Defence Regiment. And when I looked into sort of Robin Bell, I began to say, okay, so Robin Bell's the family are clearly originally from the south. And then I looked around, and the intelligence officer who had given the intelligence to the British Army unit about after Robin Bell's killing, about what had happened, and he said, oh, the man who did that is there, and his name is Michael Mann. This was untrue. Michael Mann was involved in a land dispute. He had bought a farm his family had purchased a farm from a prominent Orangeman in the area who resented that. And his name was put top of an intelligence list, handed to the British Army. Two British Army sergeants decided to go to the farm. They stabbed Michael Mann multiple times, and they killed a labourer who worked in the farm who was an inconvenient witness. So why did all this happen? Well, it happened because of memories of land ownership, memories of in terms of the Nans were connected in the 1920s to an IRA family, but were no longer involved in any republicanism whatsoever. But there was a memory in the community among the loyalist population that perhaps this was a bad family, right? And also, of course, there was the added toxicity of land ownership. What we have, we hold. There's still the tradition of Protestants not selling to Catholics and Catholics not selling to Protestants within these border regions, where land was a sort of almost a political statement of here we are. And then I began to look at, well, that UDR officer, the intelligence officer who gave the intelligence to the British Army unit, he was, of course, originally, they had, his family were from close ties to County Monaghan. So was the other local UDR commander. He was from County Monaghan as well. And then I sort of went to Lisnaskea and I walked down the main street. And of course, some of you might know the shop SD Kells, with Roy Kells was very prominent in the UDR, Ulster Defence Regiment, and in the Orange Order in County Fermanagh. The Kells were from County Cavan in the 1920s. They had moved. And then I looked at Jack Leahy, who owned the main, he owned the main pub in Lisnaskea. He was originally from Ballymacue. And actually all these people had stories from the 1920s and in the 1950s and 1960s of grievance, right? So the Leahys had, his father had been stabbed in the 1920s when law and order broke down in 1922 by local Republicans. The Leahys were very grieved about that, and they were boycotted for a time. Similarly, the Roy Kells had a story of his own family moving north across the border. And I've gotten to realise that so many of the prominent families in County Fermanagh were actually originally from the south, and some of them being born after independence and then moved, particularly in the 1950s, north, where they had rapidly sort of assimilated and joined things like the Ulster Defence Regiment. Because particularly from the border counties, from the three counties, they already had a sense of Ulsterness anyway, which had been created in the late 19th century. And the families are sort of, held on to the families. Of course, there was recruitment for the Ulster Volunteer Force in 1913, 1914 in Cavan, Monaghan, Donegal. That was very high. And so what we see is we have here now looking at people who have two generations of what they see as, and certainly some verifiably so, trauma, right? So bad things have happened to them in Cavan and Donegal particularly, less so in Monaghan perhaps in the 1920s, and for reasons I'll get into. Then they've moved across the north, and they have a story then of being targeted once, and now because many of them have purchased lands just very near the border where they can keep close connections to family and friends who remain in the Irish state, and because land is cheaper near the border, now they're on the front line again in the 1970s, and they're very active in Ulster militant movements such as Vanguard, and of course they play their role in the Ulster Defence Regiment. So this is interesting because ultimately we're showing there's a fluidity there across this line. This is not a static political line. This is something that families, some people move north, but of course their brothers, their sisters, their parents may remain in Cavan or Monaghan, just a few miles away. And this can lead to, problems. It can lead to suspicions in terms of, which side are you on? Particularly when, in the 1970s, the Troubles are at their height. And of course, the Republican campaign is basing itself in counties like Monaghan and Donegal, particularly to carry out attacks into Northern Ireland. And so I became interested in what role does memory play then in terms of the targeting or in terms of the targeting of the Protestant population in the three counties. Is there a sort of a potential here that memories or this sense of badness again that I found in County Fermanagh, that certain people could be targeted simply because of what their fathers or grandfathers did? Is this a problem? And can I or not? Or is there a level of tolerance and maturity? Have things changed, evolved? And so I wanted to look into that, and I spent the next 4 years carrying out a lot of research in the border counties, talking to a lot of people. And many people shared things with me, including documents from the period, but a number of them, of course, didn't want, like in this picture, of things to be revealed about them personally. And that has made the work quite difficult. Some were happy, others not so much, still quite fearful that there might be consequences. So in terms of the idea of feud or violence and intergenerational memory, I mean, this is something which, of course, Peter Hart covered when he talked about in West Cork, this idea of the family of the informer. So years later, the son of the informer would be remembered as such. And what I wanted to test then is, obviously, he talked about 70 years, but between 1922 and 1972, the height of the Troubles is 50 years. So some people are still alive. Indeed, there's one or two active participants on both sides who were active volunteers in the 1920s and were active again in the 1970s. Old men, but still important in terms of in terms of things like, well, in County Down particularly, bomb making actually. And so thinking about, okay, so people are alive, people remember things, they remember loyalist resistance, they remember Ulster volunteers, and that's still very much in the atmosphere of these counties, even though the Irish state now clearly has jurisdiction over the three counties. And I wanted to challenge a little bit what Richard Burke has kind of in Cambridge has talked about. People who look at things, he's criticised people like FSL Lyons, Jennifer Todd, for being primordialists, because ultimately he believes that too much of Irish history just looks at the static nature of ethnic hatred between the generations, i.e. that there's a conflict in Ulster, resentment and hatred, sectarianism gets passed down. And he said this is really, this is a disservice to history, and that what we should be considering is the two major political ideologies, unionism and nationalism. But of course, in the case of the three counties, unionism no longer is a possible political vehicle after 1920. Ultimately, loyalists there are removed from the Ulster Unionist Council in March 1920. And so, no longer can they aspire to protecting the Union. The Union is gone. And then, so people then like Terry Dooley has argued that really loyalism sort of ceases to exist after the Boundary Commission. Is that true? Or does sentiment matter? Does a sense of connection to wider Ulster, even though it's politically dangerous to maintain that connection, is that maintained nonetheless? So does that show us that perhaps it's not merely just about political ideology, unionism, or post, leaving the Commonwealth, loyalism, but can you even be a loyalist sort of after, in a republic? Is it possible to still hold on to things that are really quite dangerous? I mean, it's far safer in the 1960s and 70s to just remove yourself from that, to totally reimagine yourself from your previous generations, to say, I no longer care about an idea of Ulster or a connection or my Britishness. But what we do see is that does remain. So that perhaps that does telecomplicates Richard Burke's criticism. Perhaps there's something else going on, that emotional ties of kin, of identity, do matter in ways. But of course, we should always remember that people have agency. So Billy Fox, TD, can move miles away from, Heather Humphreys can move miles away from their grandparents' sort of political ideologies, but perhaps others do cling to the old ways. That there is variety here that we need to be conscious of. And so, of course, why is Ulster different in terms of, this isn't a partitionist argument, I'm simply saying that if you look at someone like the family I mentioned, the Bells, I mean, the Bells who were in Rosscarbery and worked there, and there was no sense of them ever joining a paramilitary organisation or ever being involved in loyalist militancy. But of course, when they moved to the border area, frontierism by its nature makes you pick choices pretty quickly, right? There's a threat out there. Are you going to contribute to your community or not? And so, of course, even people from West Cork, did that. But of course, if you were marinated in Ulsterness from the late 19th century, the Ulster clubs, and we talk about sort of Irish nationalist institutions, like sporting institutions, cultural institutions. If you're also involved in that in the border counties, then perhaps that's not something that sort of is entirely cynical. That's not something that people can believe in Ulster's sort of the history of settlement there, the history of being a sort of separate, dare I say it, even ethnos within the island of Ireland. And so there is something different about the North. And of course, this is the Burt platoon of the Ulster Volunteer Force in County Donegal, who are very well organised, quite militant. They attacked nationalists in 1918. And there's some skirmishes. And I'll talk a little bit later about Donegal during the War of Independence and later the Civil War. But there's some of these guys are still active in the 1920s as local defence groups. And of course, simply just by nature of population, it is possible to organise in ways in the northern counties, the Ulster, three counties, in a way that's not possible in the rest of rural Ireland. They simply don't have the sizable numbers. Monaghan, 25% of Monaghan is Protestant. In 1911, the vast majority of whom identify as loyalists, certainly if you go along with the membership of institutions like the Ulster clubs, and also look at the Ulster Covenant. And of course, there's an idea of not partitioning Ulster is a very strong and appealing one to them. They see Ulster as something to be kept whole, and they shouldn't. So partition for them is something to be, they're okay with partition for 9 counties, but not necessarily for, to exclude them just to kind of crudely build up the Protestant majority in Northern Ireland, which of course happens. Now, this betrayal is, of course, sincerely felt, but of course, many of the border counties don't vote for excluding the 3 counties. Armagh, Fermanagh are totally steadfastly, many representatives there in the Ulster Unionist Council are absolutely horrified that the Belfast, that Craig and others could advocate excluding their brethren, their kith and kin, their families who were in the same parishes, dioceses, etc. They could exclude them. And they remained faithful to these people for a very long time in a way that if you only study Belfast, you wouldn't kind of realise, you wouldn't be aware of. They don't like the betrayal. and they feel very badly about it. And so today there is even a certain pride in Monaghan in terms of the Ulster movement. And if you look at 2016 here, this picture, you can see this is the first time the two battalion banners or colours of the Ulster Volunteer regiments from Monaghan have been brought back together to celebrate the Ulster movement in Monaghan, right? Now that's quite a bold thing to do in 2016, and indeed some of the people who turned up to this in Glaslough, their cars were allegedly violated or vandalised later. But people wanted to express that they had a pride, that Ulster took a stand, and they also felt that Northern Ireland wouldn't exist if their forefathers took a stand, and they feel positive towards Northern Ireland. They think Northern Ireland is a construct that's worth protecting, even today. Now, again, this is a minority of people. I'm not saying this is speaking for all the Protestants' experience in Monaghan, but it is an inherited sense of pride there that is strong among some, and that's worth thinking about. Now, why is Monaghan an interesting case study in terms of the War of Independence? Well, because Monaghan has the capacity and has the numbers to resist IRA activities in the county in a way that is quite unique. Now, if you read Owen O'Duffy's reports in UCD, his reports to General Headquarters are like, I'm doing brilliantly, and I'm constantly vanquishing the Ulster Volunteers who have reorganised in 1920. But what you see actually is the local accounts from local officers are saying that we are being excluded. We can no longer operate north of Monaghan town in these areas. We cannot operate in Rockcarry anymore, and we've had to have a peace deal in Clonus after the Rosslea counter-reprisals in March 1921, and because the Loyalists are so well armed and so active. Now, there's a reason for this. There's some very capable ex-9th Battalion Royal Irish Fusiliers, non-commissioned officers, sergeants who mobilised at the time when the gentry, such as the Leslies, are going elsewhere. The NCO class organise, and they're quite effective, and they shoot. They shoot more than 40. There's more than 40 IRA casualties at the hands of Loyalists, and that's far more than Loyalists who were shot. So all O'Duffy's reports have to be taken with a pinch of salt, because when you look into them, actually the area is much more contested. And Loyalists argue in North Monaghan that they have scored a draw. They feel like the ceasefire in July is they've held their own. They've defeated one or two IRA flying columns, particularly in the north of the county, who have actually been. The RIC is getting they're working with the RIC closely, and they're kind of getting the better of the IRA in parts of the county. I think the evidence does show that that is correct. O'Duffy's claims are exaggerated that he has defeated loyalism in the county. And so we have a different situation in Cavan, which is quiet. Now, that's because, well, Republicans are, although they're very capable of in terms of things like the Dole courts, when it comes to violence, they're much less lethal than O'Duffy's Monaghan IRA. And so really, there's a contestation in 1920 where Loyalists shoot some IRA volunteers. Unlike Monaghan, they're not then taken out at sort of 3 a.m. and executed. There's kind of a standoff, a sense among the Cavan IRA that this could actually make things worse. That if we sort of energise, the Loyalists in certain parts of the county, this could actually be a distraction for us. And actually, we're doing very well in terms of the Dáil court. So Cavan is quiet, even though the Republican administration is very strong. And this picture is of a guy called George Evans, who's one of he does set up a Loyalist defence force in the county. And that's one of the few that mobilises, and it's around Coot Hill. And this is a disaster. The IRA attacked them repeatedly. The reason why it's a disaster is they have no military organisation, they have no non-commissioned, they have no ex-soldiers to lead it. And so they keep meeting in Rathkenny National School. The IRA says, thank you very much, turn up 3 times and wound quite a number of them. So this is an experiment that doesn't work, but by and large, Cavan doesn't need to organise because Cavan isn't very violent. Donegal has a contribution to the defence of Derry that is never forgotten. So Donegal, UVF, it's very quiet in East Donegal. The IRA doesn't really organise that well. Pat O'Donnell is not a great military man, to be frank. There's also sort of a mediation. The DI in Letterkenny is working with Loyalists and Republicans to prevent sort of sectarian attacks as he sees it. And so the IRA in East Donegal is not particularly active, and it's a very strong area of Loyalist strength. And Loyalists are also very focused on what they see as a threat to Derry, right? Very concerned about that, because they do not want to lose the city to which they are so connected to. And so in 1920, they send men, arms, and supplies to Derry in June to protect Derry, as they see it, from a takeover by IRA, Hibernians, whoever it is, during the riots. And the Derry Ulster Special Constabulary never forget this. And even in the 1930s, they say, where would we have been if the Donegal Loyalists had not saved us? So that's a real contribution to Northern Ireland that's never forgotten. So again, you look outside Belfast, you get a complicated history about what the 3 counties are and what they do. And remember, when this is happening, June 1920, this is just after the Ulster Unionist Council has expelled the 3 counties. So they're doing things selflessly for what becomes Northern Ireland. because they still sort of believe in it. They believe in helping their people who live close to them, who they know, who they trade with. They don't just because they may have been betrayed doesn't mean they're going to sort of give up entirely on sort of contributing to Northern Ireland. They have a sympathy towards Northern Ireland that's still there. And indeed, in 1922, I mean, you have this sense, particularly in Monaghan, where you get this argument from a number of Orangemen in the county who say, well, look, that's been a draw then. The ceasefire, the truce didn't give them a republic. The treaty didn't give them a republic. We're still in a dominion in the empire. So therefore, we should be able to serve in the Ulster Special Constabulary if we want, and they do in substantial numbers. 15% of the Ulster Special Constabulary A specials in 1922 are from the three counties. And so we see that they have this kind of naive, perhaps, but hope that you can still be loyal, Ulster, imperial, but sort of render unto Caesar in the Free State, but believe in Britishness, Ulsterness as well. And that, of course, is proven to be, very naive very quickly. And so what we see is in 1922 is this man is the father of an A special. His house gets attacked by the National Army. He's particularly aggrieved about this. He feels that I am a loyal citizen, i.e. loyal to the Dominion, what's becoming the Dominion of the Free State. I'm loyal to that. And I'm also loyal to, us being a Dominion, right? So he doesn't see a contradiction in loyalty to Dublin and loyalty to Ulster and Britishness. It may be naive, but some people did hope for that. And of course, we see a lot of, especially if you look at the attack in Clones in February 1922, we see a number of the fatalities there, casualties, are people from the three counties. You get two special constables from Cavan who are killed. All their parents remain in Cavan, families are still, so it's a complicated picture whereby they're sort of joining things in the north, but remaining also connected or even living in the south. And then, of course, we see the kidnapping of some special constables, including Special Constable Robert Coulson, who's kidnapped in 1922, who's got family on both sides of the border around the Clones area. But of course, we have proving that in some ways the loyalist resilience is that we have this contingency plan that's put in place whereby the loyalists are ready for Armageddon, right? So if the National Army, if it all collapses, if W.T. Cosgrave if the whole arrangement falls apart, they need to be ready to move quickly. And so they have this plan to cut their way through Monaghan and seek sanctuary then in Fermanagh if necessary, if it really gets out of hand. And actually the man they're speaking to is a guy who's formerly from Skibbereen. He lived in Skibbereen. It's Reverend Reverend J.C. Taylor, whose wife was the sexton here in Skibbereen in the church, and he, Irish speaking, had been working in West Cork for many years, and then of course he goes to Ulster and he finds he's originally actually from a Tyrone family, so it's quite easy for him. But he goes back to Ulster, Monaghan, and then he ends up being a commandant of the B Specials. But interesting, they're Irish speaking, they love Irish language, and they're sort of very, they have this rather unique, varied background. And he sort of is liaising with the Monaghan and Cavan loyalists in 1922 to say, actually, do you know what, we could use the men? Because South East Fermanagh is a very Catholic nationalist area, and actually parts of Monaghan, of course, very loyalist. And so he said, look, we could bring them over and then put up an even greater defence if the National Army and the IRA invade ultimately. But the worst doesn't come to pass. And again, this is why Eve talked a little bit about why Ireland is, can be a little bit more unique. I mean, there's people like James McKenna, who is, one of the guys who's burning loyalist houses in the 1920, who's involved in attacks to try and raid arms from loyalists. And then he sort of turns around in 1922 quite quickly and says, no, we need discipline, law and order. He basically helps to set up the civic guard. He is a disciplinarian. And so this is quite a change. And loyalists find they can work with that, even with someone like McKenna, who was from Glasslough and they particularly resented previously. They find that this is a pragmatic alliance now. And you get, interesting conciliatory speeches by W.T. Cosgrave praising, Monaghan's Protestants for standing up to the gunmen, right? But the gunmen who they really stood up to was mostly 1920-21, right? So it's kind of a strange shift where he's now saying, oh, well done. We're proud of you for standing up to the anti-treatyites, as he sees it, and the gunmen and the flying column that's active in North Monaghan for a brief time. And so he praises them because also what's going on is a lot of cooperation at the local level, a lot of sort of, intelligence and passing on information. And the British government are also commenting on this. So in terms of 1922, in Cavan, we see a collapse in law and order, particularly in the west of the county. And that is devastating for the loyalist population. They are targeted in a very almost systematic way in terms of if an IRA unit simply wants to just take food or clothing or whatever, they just, loyalist houses are, it's often the first they go to, right? So not necessarily a lot of fatal violence going on, but there's a lot of fear and a lot of raids and some agrarianism going on as well that is quite punctures morale, particularly in the west of the county where, of course, loyalists are more isolated. And here they simply never quite organised, even in 1920-21, and are quite exposed then to violence. So in terms of Donegal, well, Donegal is really, they're not ready for what happens. They hand over a lot of their UVF weapons to Derry, and they think the treaty is going to work. And then, a lot of Munster guerrilla, anti-treaty IRA guerrillas particularly move in, and they bring with them a lot of violence, particularly in Letterkenny, Raphoe. I mean, there is, burnings of shops, houses. The British military intelligence believe, far more than West Cork, that this is the worst part of the 26 counties in terms of violence against Protestants, and they feel that this is really, really quite worrying. The Derry UVF, Derry Ulster Special Constabulary at this point, because Samuel Wallace Kennedy's family are from Donegal, are threatening to go into Donegal, and the British government are quite worried about this. Oh wow, as well as the northern offensive from the south, we could be dealing with a loyalist offensive into Donegal, because this violence is so extreme. And so again, fatalities are low, but the type of burnings and attacks and robberies are high. So what we see then is British military intelligence are reporting. Well, this is hard to verify, but certainly their reporting is that what was formerly the Ulster Special Constabulary, because the Ulster Special Constabulary did recruit in Donegal as opposed to other parts of what became the Free State, that actually the Ulster Special Constabulary were organising to support the National Army, right, in 1922, and actually they were recruited to the National Army. That's not true. They were never brought into the National Army, but certainly loyalists. There is evidence to show that loyalists themselves wrote to W.T. Cosgrave saying, "Look what we did for you during the Trouble." So it does seem to be something going on in terms of assisting the National Army versus the anti-treatyites, and that works for them. And really, by the late 1922, early 23, the worst is over. Of course, Pedigo is a unique example because it is essentially, even geographically, it's Lost Fermanagh, right? The chairman of Fermanagh County Council lives in Pedigo in Donegal, a guy called John McHugh, and he's a nationalist. But in terms of Pedigo is a predominantly loyalist village that is part of the Fermanagh UVF regiment, and that Basil Burke, the county commandant for the Ulster Special Constabulary, recruits from Pedigo in the same way he's recruited from the UVF into Fermanagh. So they have a head constable there from the Donegal side. So there's special constables there. And in January 1922, after the treaty, they go on the offensive against the IRA in the village, and they burn out one or two volunteers. They attack IRA sympathisers. This is unwise, right? Because obviously you're now in a state where you need to be very careful. You may be a majority in your village, but you are not. Retribution could come down the line, and that's exactly what happened. So Pedigo, after the British, of course, ultimately, a British army, the only time there's been really a full-scale invasion of the new state, on June the 4th, 1922, occupied Pedigo, of course, until January 1923. During that period, unfortunately, they also use a local police force to identify local Republicans who are local Donegal Protestants. So when the handover happens in 1923, it's done very carefully and with great, I would say, great care by the National Army officer there, Commandant J.V. Joyce. He's very careful in terms of not trying to aggravate sectarian tensions in the locality. But nonetheless, it's clear that some loyalists can't stay and they leave. Some never come back. A few come back. We're talking small numbers, perhaps sort of 12 to 14 families leave. But we do see a steady trickle on into 23, 24 after this. So Pedigo is, so in terms of the memory then, well, I suppose I haven't got too much time left, so I better sort of skip on quickly to the intergenerational aspect of this. But just say, it is interesting, sometimes you get this deliberate misremembering. So people who have connections in County Cavan, for example, sometimes, like to say to neighbours, it was the Black and Tans who did that in 1922 to my parents. But of course, the Black and Tans weren't in Cavan in 1922. And then, of course, there are memories of people in terms of Donegal. One of the people that really gets remembered quite persistently in the Newton Cunningham area is what happened to William Canning, who was a man who was, abducted by Munster IRA volunteers, treated very, very badly by local accounts, and certainly did end up in the Donegal, in the local mental health hospital where he died in 1982. And he was a constant living reminder of what had happened, the trauma that the people in the locality felt they had gone through. And then, of course, we have also an interesting continuation, sort of post-partition, in that actually, if you look at the figures, Protestant recruitment from the three counties had always been very strong towards the RIC, and it continues pretty much intact after that. So even if you look at the 1970s, you have 12 RUC constables were from one Donegal parish. In the whole of the Irish state, there's only 18 Protestant Gardaí, right? So there's a tradition of recruitment to the RUC that goes on. And one of the most capable, interesting police officers, of course, in the Troubles is the Detective Inspector Cecil Patterson, who was from Belturbet and was was the intelligence officer in Belfast who, against both loyalists and Republicans, which is really why he was shot in Ardoyne in 1971. So you get a lot of these guys sometimes at the very top of the police force who are from the south. Both Cecil Patterson and his wife Jean, maintained a farm in Cavan and amazingly kept travelling down there. And so what we see is this kind of also endurance at the political level. So it's not complete cut off. What we see is, for example, Alex Hazlitt, who's very much was UVF commander, of course, in 1913-14. He then later goes on to be a TD for many years. But he gets help from the Ulster Unionist Party in the 1927 election, who sent him down an expert to help in Monaghan with so ties are not absolutely cut. There is a sense of guilt, and also, of course, the local county Ulster Unionist branches in Fermanagh Armagh want to help, and they're sympathetic. And then, of course, after 1949, this is when really loyalists in the three counties, this is when their morale is completely punctured. This is really a very, very bad time for them. They feel as if a deal has been broken. That ultimately, Alex Hazlitt says, we're now like the Sudetans. We've basically and we can no longer be loyal. How can we be loyal? We were loyal to the deal. The deal was that we could express our identity, and we can't anymore. And he makes some very angry speeches about, that there was more patriotism in sort of Monaghan's loyalist community, including to the Free State, than the people with guns who had attacked them, previous years. So it's a very angry speech. It's not just this sort of, seamless conciliation where former loyalists just become good nationalists. It's not like that. And in the 50s, you see very high levels of migration to Northern Ireland from the three counties. Now, that's all to do with economic factors. But there is a sense that something has broken. And the people who move north do talk about this in future years. And of course, some people just keep to the old ways anyway. So, this is from the 1950s. This is Lara Loyal Orange Lodge, who have produced a nice little memorial to George VI. So, it's complicated. And also, they still, in terms of some families who leave, of course, some of these, bring with them a sense of grievance. Now, whether some of that is genuine or whether it's used for political expediency to try and make a case against the Republic, that is sometimes difficult to discern. Jim Allister, for example, who's now the leader of the TUV in Northern Ireland and MLA, says we had to leave Monaghan in the 1950s because we felt the noose tightening, right? So that's an argument. Look south and look what happened to me, right? Look what happened to my family. My brothers were born there. My parents are all Monaghan loyalists. Look what happened to them, right? So that is an argument that resonates in certain parts of Northern Ireland, particularly in the border areas. But also a lot of people, Bangor was a big area of settlement from Monaghan and Cavan. And of course, they elected Jim Kilfedder, who was from a Donegal Leitrim background. And so you have this sense of grievance there that persists in Northern Ireland about this idea that the treaty was broken. And then, of course, there's the idea of unfinished business. So this is you can't really read this, but in 1967, they're talking about a man, there's an former IRA veteran who's writing to a local priest, and he's saying, look, this guy has died now. This was Jim Boyd, who had shot a number of IRA volunteers in the 1920s. There's nothing in his obituary about him doing that, but he was an ex-British soldier who'd organised loyalist defence in Balnagal, which is just near Monaghan town, and shot and been quite successful in sort of, in his words, clearing the area of the enemy, right? So, but he stayed in the same area and lived there, and in 1967 was still alive, and people still remembering what was done. Of course, Caledon sparks off, this in terms of the sectarianism in Northern Ireland, in terms of local authority, the discrimination against Catholics, all these extreme, all these things we know about. Well, Caledon is a sensitive topic too for border Protestants, because of course, in 1922, a number of Protestants from families in Donegal had been expelled from Glaslough in County Monaghan. And where did they move to? Caledon, Right? So Caledon was an area where a lot of Monaghan Protestants moved to, including in the 1950s. And so when Caledon kicks off in 1968, there is an underappreciated refrain from now. There's no excuse for what happens in Caledon, the discrimination that goes on in 1968. But of course, the refrain from some local loyalists who are from Monaghan originally is, well, we had to leave. Here is where we are. This is why we do it. Now, that's not forgivable. That doesn't make it, moral. But that was the kind of sense of there's an atrocity against us, and therefore, we are. This is why Caledon is our place, and we're going to keep it. And Emily Beattie, of course, the controversial thing is that Emily Beattie was this young woman who was given a house that really should have been allocated to a Catholic family in need. Of course, she was marrying a Monaghan Protestant, and again, Austin Curry and others said, look, they privilege the three counties, loyalists, Protestants, they give them everything to come over here. They take things from Northern nationalists, right? So it's a very powerful but also dangerous kind of rhetoric. And so what we see then is on both sides we have the sense of grievance that from Fermanagh's civil rights movement complaining they're bringing all these three counties, all these Ulster Protestants from the Irish state over here, giving them things. But of course, from the side of the people who are given the land, they feel as if they've been pushed out. Some of them, right? So here you get a UDR private here, ex-UDR soldier, Esmond Jackson, whose brother was killed in Tyrone. And he talks about, as far as he's concerned, most of the people around them living on the border who were in the UDR were all pushed out from the south, right? So all his neighbours were originally from the south. And indeed, of the 5 families who were moved out of the southwest garrison area of County Fermanagh in 1972 for their own safety, after Johnny Fletcher, born in Leitrim from Kiltyclare, they were all, 4 of them were from the south, right? So originally from the south. So again, it was a sense of, and as one of the families said, this is what is happening again, right? So they have this sense of repeated trauma. Now, whether, as I'll show you, some of this can be exaggerated for political means, or this is more genuine, but we see in the case of Jim Kilfeder, his account, of course, Trinity graduate, but very much proud of his Donegal UVF background, also volunteer force in the early 20th century. So that, ultimately we had to go by boat. This is 1931 when he was just a tiny child. We had to leave in the middle of the night. There was great unrest against the Orange Order in Leitrim at the time, which I don't have time to get into. So, there was certainly a lot of people did move in 1931. And then, of course, post kind of Caledon, there's a lot of allegations, and the Bill Crawford, Emily Beattie scandal, there's a lot of allegations that the B Specials are in Monaghan. They're being recruited in Monaghan. And so you get a lot of speeches, Austin Curry saying, if you just give us the names. You also get Paul Mulligan from Sinn Féin saying there's no point in burning them out until we know who they are, and when we know them, who they are. And then, of course, these rumours turn very toxic. You see attacks in Donegal and Monaghan. Derek Scott's house, his 3-year-old son, is nearly burned alive in a petrol bomb attack on his farm in County Monaghan. And then there is an immediate loyalist response in that the brother, Senator J.J. Brennan, who was an IRA commander in the 20s, and his brother was also a volunteer. His brother's in his 60s now, but his house is attacked by loyalists in County Monaghan on the same night. And then we get also sort of these troubles, kind of, the Ulsterness of these counties kind of bubbling up as well, of course, because a lot of these Orange Lodges go across the border to celebrate the loyal orders, and that leads to riots in St. Johnston, which is a kind of 50-50 village. And things look very grim there. Now, what's interesting about the St. Johnston riots in July is that a Garda car is burned, the Orange Lodge is attacked, the Masonic Lodge is attacked. People try and say it's from people from Northern Ireland. That's not true. The people who were charged were all from the local area, but or at least the majority of them were. I should be careful. But in terms of the UDA responses, which totally baffles Taoiseach Jack Lynch, he gets a letter from Andy Robinson, who's the Derry Brigadier of the UDA, right? And Andy Robinson says, if you do this to our people again, there will be consequences. And Lynch is like, who is our people? But of course, Robinson is from Donegal, right? So he's been born in Donegal, Castlefin. And so he is moving, his family have moved across the border. They have a story about what happened to them, right? And Robinson is energized about what happens in Donegal. Now, again, also for cynical political reasons, right? Look what's happening, St. Johnston. It's a good way to sort of advertise that Republic is not a safe place for you. Don't be kind, don't be conciliatory towards that state. Of course, people are cynically using it, but there's also, like a lot of stories, a lot of accounts, if there's a bit of truth in it, then that can go a long way, right? Then we have the situation, Billy Fox, who I referred to as this figure who sort of transformed himself in terms of his family background, saying, that's done. My grandfather may have signed the Ulster Covenant, but that's nothing to do with me today. I am a proud Irishman, proud citizen of the Republic, and that's where I stand. I'm also a proud member of the Church of Ireland. Okay? Now, Fox, unfortunately, that's not good enough. And the slander of Fox is appalling. And it's done by 2 generations of the same family. So you've got the Lenahans, sort of targeting him as a B special. And Fox complains about this. Both PJ Lennon, who was, of course, an IRA, he was involved in the IRA in the 20s and was in Belfast. And there's allegations that there's all these sort of horrific kind of sectarian abuse that he gets about. Senator Brennan writes that he has blacked the name of Monaghan, accuses me of friends with Lord Brookborough, and it's really, really quite grim stuff. And also his fiance's family are also sort of brought into this, and that, of course, people do remember that Robert Coulson was kidnapped in 1922, and the family originally had some ties to Fermanagh, right? So they do remember that about the Coulsons. That's dangerous, right? So that is dangerous. The Coulsons in the 1970s have nothing to do with any militancy whatsoever in any Ulster movement. They are quiet, industrious farmers. But of course, memory can be sort of filtering down. That poison can drip. And so what is the origin? So of course, like a lot of things, the danger is that local knowledge, there is sometimes a little bit of truth in there. There's something in the water that means that people can point to. And of course, with Billy Fox, it was the fact that there was his grandfather was called William Fox. And so there was, George Fox, father was William, George Fox, who was the leader of the UVF in that area, right, in the Lochbawn area. Now, that was not his grandfather. That was another man with the same name. And instead of being from Courtubber, he was from Corlay, right, which is just another townland very near. But unfortunately, an IRA veteran in the area, who was one of the organisers of the old IRA, sort of gave an account saying he was from Courtubber. Right, so we raided the big UVF men in this area from the Foxes from Courtubber, and there's only one Fox family from Courtubber, and that's Billy Fox, right? And his uncle, of course, was still alive at the time, going back to the, and had signed the Ulster Covenant. So, this is it's dangerous stuff as it turns out. And then, of course, there's tip-offs, lots of tip-offs to the guards that loyalists in the county, so-called loyalists in the county, are storing arms for the UVF and the UDA, right? So you get a lot of this. And of course, there is, there are arms raids by the guards then in response to this. They go in, one family, the McConkeys, right near New Bliss, they actually do seize some ammunition, and they are charged. And they're brought to the district court in Clones. And District Justice Shaw says, he looks around and he says, okay, I'm going to, this is ammunition, but it is not the ammunition you think it is. Don't let this become something it's not. All this ammunition, of course, the McConkeys were involved in the New Bliss UVF and the Loyalist Defence Group that was set up in the 1920s, and were very involved in that, but they had nothing to do with anything since, right? But the rumour spread, indeed. Michael Cunningham wrote a book about it, Monaghan's County of Intrigue, who says that, look, here are all these, all post, he said, opposite, all post-1945 ammunition, and the guards did nothing, and the judge was sympathetic, and that's the Quisling government for you. They overlooked these things. And so rumours spread then about all these, from this court case spiral, and people began to believe that quartermasters for the UVF were living in County Monaghan. And of course, this leads to the raid on the Coulson family, right, in March 1974. The killing of Billy Fox arrives at the same time as the raid. People have to genuinely believe that this is the case. So how do we get to a situation where local IRA volunteers believe that Monaghan Protestants are acting as quartermasters for the UVF? That is a sort of, that takes intergenerational whispering, rumours. It takes some essence of truth 50 years ago, but may not be true today. It takes the confusion of that, and you end up with the burning of a farmhouse outside Clones in County Monaghan in 1974, and the killing of Senator Fox, who tried to run from the scene and was shot dead when he arrived in his car on that night. Of course, Ross Hurst and his daughter were also killed. The Hursts were from Glaslough in County Monaghan, and the rumour spread there that the Hursts were bad loyalists, right? Bad family. And that was a very current rumour at the time, and reported to the guards on a number of occasions, as the Dublin Monaghan bombings inquiry made clear. Now, the Hursts were very active loyalists in the early 20th century. They were even mentioned in Parliament in Westminster for being so, they were armed loyalists, they were active, they defended the Glaslough area. There's nothing to suggest in the 1970s that Ross Hurst was involved in any of that. But he moved across the border, born in County Monaghan, very active in the loyal orders in Monaghan, moved across the border initially to Middletown. After his daughter was killed, he moved further away. His daughter was shot dead, very awful crime. And then Ross Hurst was, when he went back to Glaslough for a Royal Black Preceptory meeting, he was abducted and killed within minutes. So again, that rumour that he was responsible for the Monaghan bombing, that he was involved in all these attacks in Monaghan, really did prove to be pretty fatal in terms of the persistent targeting of his family. And of course, what this leads, all this memory has political capital, right? So I talked about Jim Kilfeather, but there was others. I mean, Bill Craig, the leader of Ulster Vanguard, you know, a lot of his childhood was spent in County Cavan, and he used to talk about, I've seen what it's like down there. I've seen it with my own eyes. Now, nobody in Ballyconnell has a memory of Bill Craig having a tough time, right? But in the 1930s, but that was the account that he was giving. Ernest Baird also had that account. And of course, some people wore this as a badge of pride. So Jim Kilfeather's election agent was a man from Donegal, a friend of his mother's family, William Farrell, who said, you know, when the Ulster credentials of Kilfeather, because he had a bit of a southern accent, were criticised, you know, he said, when he left Donegal with a price on his head in 1922 was not because of disloyalty to the English throne, you know, big speech, right? You know, but, you know, he said that it's a lot harder to be a loyalist in Donegal than it's to sit and Portadown, because that's where Kilfeather was standing, you know. And actually people felt a bit shamed by that. You know, these were tough frontiermen, and they deserved respect, right? They kept the faith. And of course, as I talked about, there were also some people convicted of terrorism offences who were originally from the south, and that then led to more suspicion. It's sort of, you know, if Jim Weir's father is the gamekeeper in Lochbawn, or, you know, and he's back and forward, and Jim Weir admitted he planned to bomb Clontibbert, John Weir, who was an RUC officer who was part of the Glenanne gang, essentially, or sort of cooperated with them, and then sort of, you know, conspired to carry out attacks across the border by his own admission. So, you know, this can then lead to a toxicity, or sort of, you know, more fevered minds sorry, I better wind up. More fevered minds can lead to conclusions that are not there. So I think, again, there is a memory, but then also there are people who, of course, do move a few miles across the border and sort of, you know, refine their Ulsterness, or choose that that's something that they want to commit to. And of course, then there are many people who go in an entirely different direction. But of course, you know, that nuance is not always appreciated by those who are, you know, quick to jump to slander or jump to conclusions, and those conclusions, of course, can be dangerous. In terms of Ernie Baird, his cousin was a Fine Gael candidate at one point, who was also slandered. Vote Boggs, get Paisley. Bertie Boggs in Donegal. But Baird was himself, he used to talk about, you know, the terrible time that his family had in Malin, in County Donegal. There's no evidence for this. I couldn't find any. And they seem to be a popular family. Malin was a sort of, you know, calm place, really, comparatively. And so it's very hard to know what he's talking about. But he uses that clearly for electoral benefit. So to conclude, and thank you for staying with me. It's been quite a gallop over 3 generations. But in terms of, you know, unfinished business in Monaghan, I mean, Monaghan's population declines. It has the smallest share relative to population of Protestants by the start of this century, compared to Cavan and Donegal. It had the greatest share, right, in 1911. What's going on there? I don't know. But Monaghan's resistance, I think, certainly led to put something in the water that was dangerous in subsequent generations, including in the 70s to certain families. I didn't have time to get into all the families. There are quite a number of others who were targeted, and some of whom left in the 1970s. But I suppose as well that in terms of the memory of Ulster Protestant atrocity, and this really is used for political means, it has an effect. It mobilises Ulster Vanguard. It leads them to gain support. Ernie Baird tops the poll in Fermanagh South Tyrone. You know, Kilfeather, they all talk this language of, look at us. You know, if you liaise too close, if ties are too close to the south, you know, we can tell you what happens. We can give you an example. And then also, I suppose, one thing I haven't had time to get into is, but we need to also ask why certain communities roll back, why things don't get worse, right? I mean, there was some terrible incidents where Donegal Protestants accused of loyalist crimes they're not guilty of, but there are many people in the community who are embarrassed by those accusations and try to sort of make peace and try and sort of make sure that good social ties endure, you know, in Donegal and other places. So I think that there's a project there as well, which is very important, about the absence of violence, right? So why is it gets bad, but it doesn't get worse? And I'm still grappling with the answer to that important question. Perhaps some of you will have helped me in that direction. Thank you very much.
Well, I don't know about you, but my head is spinning. And I was just wondering, how do you keep it all straight? I was thinking about, you know, all the different terms you use and how this would look like the most complicated Venn diagram of history that I've ever seen. Did you have sticky notes on a board, you know, or use a spreadsheet, or how did you keep it all straight?
I suppose, growing up in West Cork and, understanding who owns what, and it's very useful.
And
So
who is our people?
well, precisely, and you can explain a lot in terms of land ownership in West Cork. There's theories there in terms of that are fascinating, and of course having to know your neighbours. So mapping, rural topography from actually that is West Cork is very different, right? As I made a point at the start, but rural Ireland is, if you understand the parish,
Yes.
you can go a long way. So.
Okay, questions?
I'm very intrigued about the last bit of what you were in fact talking about, which was the entrenchment of attitude. I had an aunt who lived in the north of Ireland, and as a child, I used to go with my parents and bring her to the Enterprise, which was the train that ran straight to Belfast. It only stopped at one place, which was Portadown. And on one of these occasions, I had to go to the loo, and I went into the loo in the train, and there was a notice there that said, "Not while the train is standing in the station," and somebody had written underneath, "Except in Portadown." Now, that was an entrenched attitude, which had probably very little justification, but it triggered something in my mind, and I set up with a number of other people a charity which basically took Protestant children from the north of Ireland to Roman Catholic families in the south, and vice versa, which was not as easy as it sounds. It was a very, very difficult thing to do because of the family attitudes. And the reason I did it was to try to break the chain of event in attitude that people all believed. If you were a Protestant family in the north of Ireland, the Roman Catholics were evil, and conversely. And it actually had a modest success and resulted in a couple of things like the Mara cycle and the Mara swim, where people moved backwards and forwards across the border. And there was the beginning of an understanding that conventional wisdom was not appropriate in this situation. That was all I tried to do. It was eventually taken over by a much larger charity started by Tony O'Reilly, who thought it was a good idea, and a lot of our original thoughts disappeared with that. But I would be interested in your view about how you construct things to fracture entrenched attitude in this highly politicized situation.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I think I think certainly in rural Ulster, there's always been things. It's not the Balkans, right? So it's not. So some people try and sort of we have to be careful in terms of the violence is limited in terms of it doesn't seem like that way to its victims, but at the start of each bout of violence, you see sort of patterns like hay burning. In the 1970s as well, and you see like the burning of the GA Hall or an Orange Hall, and actually compared to other civil war type conflicts or wars that are, there is also a cohesion in Ulster. I think in rural Ulster, in terms of people having in these underpopulated areas having a sense that of not being completely cut off from their neighbours and understanding that there are decent people, but at the same time you'll have this kind of circular narrative then, even when people who are involved in militant organizations saying, yes, but we needed to send a message, and the message sending is part of the problem because that keeps us cut off. And so that's it's sometimes people talk about we need to the GA in Ulster needs to become a whole of community, but the GA in Ulster traditionally has this sense of that over there, right? And that's why GA halls initially, if you came to this you'd say, why are they burning a sporting organization's hall? But of course, that would be inherent to the kind of the national militancy that they believed started in the late 19th century, and that the GA is not a normal sporting organization would be the loyalist argument traditionally. But it was also a way of signaling. So you didn't go out necessarily and try and massacre a whole village, or you didn't that type of extreme violence is very, very rare. And so I do think that shows actually it's very depressing for people who, obviously, the victims of the Troubles and the victims, nothing seems moderate to them, right? It seems like this is barbaric terrorism, cruelty. But in terms of, there is also that, there are also better angels there in the communities that have always been there, particularly in rural Ulster, who have always valued their neighbours. And it's when the back is, so we are looking at limited periods of 1920s a few years, 70s a few years, when things get very bad. But what holds for the rest of the time? Is it because maybe in the 1930s the Catholic nationalist population are so demoralised, there's no thought given to a radical militant campaign? But perhaps there's also a sort of sense of tolerance between the communities that means that there's lots of potential there. And I think that is true. So, one of the things about Brexit is that upended a lot of the progress. We are in Foster and Croke Park, symbols, which still some people laugh at, but are important. And we had moments there where you could see things beginning to transition, and those strong bonds that have always been there, sort of being further strengthened as opposed to weakened. So I'm actually optimistic in that I think that rural communities, that there is a kindness there and a tolerance there. It takes certain political conditions to be set for that to evaporate, but it is hard to put back together. So in some ways we should look at the quiet moments as well as the quiet long periods as well as the sharp violent moments. But I agree, it's certainly a huge, you talked about Portadown and Craigavon area, that's a big challenge in terms of community work. I think Fermanagh is often Ulster unionism, loyalism for Fermanagh is often been quite militant at the same time as neighbour relations are actually oddly sort of, they know each other, right? It's convivial. So there's ties, but at the same time, but it's because it's the frontier. And so we need to deal with that frontier mentality. And so when people in this state talk about what would a United Ireland look with loyalists in it, well, the first question is we've had that, but we haven't really analysed it in terms of, what was done wrong or what we could learn from. But I think also we need to think about the frontier mentality is hard to, we need to think about that carefully, because people who are very tolerant in some ways can be quite militant in their politics when it comes to what they see as the weakening of the frontier.
You kind of touched on my question already, and I hate asking historians to predict the future. But what lessons do you think that can be learned from this for the potential of a united Ireland?
Wow, you put me in the spot there. Yeah, I mean, look, in terms of United Ireland, I think people are aware of this, but the first question that will have to be asked in a way that wasn't asked in 1949. I'm not saying that, I think, look, obviously 70,000 people, it may be the size of Limerick at that time, in terms of people who identified from a loyalist background in 3 counties I'm talking about. Obviously, you can't have the majority of a 26-county state saying, oh, we don't want to be a republic because we have to be 70,000 people who might be a little bit iffy about it, right? Or maybe more. So I understand why the republic happened and why people were fully entitled to go for that. But in the United Ireland context, where we've much more than 70,000, we need to think about how British is the new state, right? A controversial question, but it's a hard question. It's something I ask my students sometimes. Okay, so United Ireland. How are you going to protect Britishness in that? Oh no, some of the answers. Others are like, oh, I need to think about that. I don't know how to do that. So these are very, very difficult conversations, and I do not have any good solutions. I am thankfully a historian, and I am, but I recognise, if you look at this picture, for example, of 2016, you still have people, and Halpin said it in the Mocknam seminar. I think. Our president had a moment when he said it, but it was, there may be people within this state who have not felt that everything's been kind to them, right? We should think very much about that in the future in terms of, I'm not saying that we need major political change now, but we should reflect a little bit on that history, because we have this Ulster loyalist minority, have lived within the state previously. And they are still posing some of the descendants of this population are still posing difficult questions. I mean, Lord Willie Hayes in the House of Lords saying that he wants a British passport for people from Donegal, right? He gets laughed at. He's from Donegal, right? He's laughed at for that, but he says no. It means a lot to some people. Okay, so let's look at that. How true is it? In terms of, this is complicated. This case complicates narratives in Belfast and Dublin. The Belfast hate talking about the betrayal. They wrote history books saying the natural Ulster plantation was the 6 counties. Nonsense. And we all know that's not true. Cyril Falls is wrong. But it's same in Dublin. It was like, well, if you just become good nationalists, good Republicans would be fine, you know. But that's we can't do that again, right? We have a bigger population, so I think we can learn from this. And you know, listening to some of the descendants is also, I think many of them have an evolving attitude towards the Irish state. They feel they much more belong to it now in the last 20 years. But some of them still are also very conscious of that they have a ties to Northern Ireland that they believe in strongly. The ties to Ulster, they feel that Ulsterness, and they're proud of it. And you can see here, some of them are very proud of that Ulster heritage. You know?
Okay, well, I think we're all really happy that you're a historian too. One of my favorite quotes is from Jane Austen, and it kept coming back to me as I was listening to you talking about intergenerational memory. In circumstances like this, a good memory is unpardonable, she said. Thank you very much,
Very
Dr.
good.
Burke.
That's great. Thank you.